Good morning, everyone. My name is Kaylin Kelly. I'm a consultant here at IBIS. I've been here for a couple of years now, and I've been working on analysis cubes pretty much the whole time I've been here in some fashion. I think the analysis cubes are a great tool. It's pretty easy to get it up and running. I always, of course, recommend IBIS assist you with that. There are a couple things that we can help. We can definitely get some training in, make sure everybody's on the same page. So today I just want to talk about some of the functionalities in Analysis Cubes so you don't forget it as a reporting option. I do want to mention that Analysis Cubes is designed to be an additional reporting tool as opposed to a replacement reporting tool. So Analysis Cubes would not typically be used instead of Management Reporter or FRX or any of your traditional reporting softwares. This would be an ad hoc additional reporting tool to be used for anyone that needs to analyze the data a little deeper. Another thing that Analysis Cubes is really good for is creating dashboards, which is something that I'm going to focus on today, and I will show you some of the ad hoc reporting as well. So business intelligence is what Analysis Cubes is considered. Business intelligence is a set of theories, methodologies, architectures, and technologies that transform raw data into meaningful and useful information. So this means that the raw data that you enter into GP isn't useful until you can do something with it. So if you can just inquire onto a single document, it's not very useful if you can't look at that information compared to all the other data in your database. So business intelligence is the process of taking all of that information, consolidating it in some way, or filtering it in some way to get to the information that you actually consider useful and meaningful. So first I want to talk a little bit about the security in Analysis Cubes. That's something that comes up a lot. Security for ACE, Analysis Cubes for Excel, the acronym would be ACE for that, is Windows authentication. So this is important because you don't need a GP username already set up to be able to give someone access to the Analysis Cubes. If you're using a hosted environment, or if you have a certain number of SQL licenses, that is something to consider before you give your whole company access, but GP licenses are not required. The security is controlled by role-based setup, so you can use the security down to a cube or a dimension level. I see a lot of clients using cube security, for example, for financials. They might not want their salesperson to be able to see the financials data, so you can give the salesperson just the sales cube. You can also limit the dimensions, for example, companies. Since the Analysis Cubes are going to consolidate all of the GP databases, you'll see every company. If a certain user is not supposed to see the transactions in one company, you can limit them within the cubes themselves. So I'm going to show you a few things now. So let me switch my sharing over to my desktop now. Okay, so this is the first page of my dashboard. So I created this dashboard to show some financials information on the first tab. So right now, everything on this tab is connected into the Financials cube. And I want to point out a couple features of this report. First of all, several of these things are pivot tables. So if you're familiar with pivot tables, that's the primary way that people access the Analysis Cubes information. This pivot table is using the account summary categories as well as the month dates across the top. I've also included some spark lines on the far right for these accounts so I can see over time how each of these pieces of information have changed. For example, my Beginning entries are pretty negative and most accounts increase from there. My administrative expenses don't have any expenses, so good job to this Fabricam company for not having any expenses. And this is a Fabricam company that I'm using for a demonstration, so the test data can be a little unusual at times. So I've selected the overhead accounts so that I can track immediately where my expenses are, where I'm spending my money, and what's costing me the most. Below this, I have all of my checkbooks. My checkbook information is going to be at the summary level, and it comes also from financials within the bank transaction information. I also have spark lines here so I can keep an eye on my cash for each of those checkbooks. Again, this is Fabricam data, so I'm sure your checkbook is going to look a little bit different than that volatile little checkbooks over there. At the very bottom, I have some cube formulas. So cube formulas are used a lot in dashboarding because they don't expand like a pivot table. For example, right now I have my checkbook with a plus sign under it, and if I expand my pivot table, it would end up replacing some data and messing up the formatting of my report. If I use cube formulas, everything's going to stay in the same place, but the data will still be refreshable because it's still connected back to the cube. And this is using the native cube value and cube member functionality inside of Excel. Those are standard cubes, no third-party softwares or add-ons required to use the cube formulas. And this chart is based off of my cube formulas. So whenever I update my data or refresh this report, all of that information is going to pull in and update my chart as well as my values. In the top left corner, I have slicers. Slicers are going to be in Excel 2007 and above. Slicers are a way to control the dates in your reports without having to change each individual report date. So if I change my year to 2014, you'll notice that all three of my charts changed. My two pivot tables changed, as well as my cube formulas, because each of those pieces of data are referencing my slicers. So I can come in here and adjust my dates and compare across years. I linked those together by using the report connections. So all of the reports the pivot tables are connected to this slicer. And in my cube formulas, I included a variable to pull in the slicer master date information. The next tab is my sales data. My sales information is right now geared specifically to a salesperson. So I also have a slicer for a salesperson. So I can send this tab or this report out to my salespeople, and they can select their name and view all the sales information related to them. You'll notice that when I pick a new name, all of these charts update because they're using that particular salesperson. If I wanted to view all of my salespeople, I would simply clear my filter on my slicer, and I would be able to view the total for each of these reports. For example, my items is a top 10 list based on the profit. And I did top 10 by going to my items filter and creating a value filter for top 10 based on the profit for each item. I did a similar chart over here with customers, and I'm doing a value filter for my top 10 customers. Again, if I don't choose a salesperson, this would be across all salespeople. And if I chose a salesperson, it would be specific to that employee. I can also update my dates and my month information here. And you'll notice that as I change my slicer to some of the months, my data is going to reflect that information. I also have some conditional formatting built into some of my reports. Some of my conditional formattings, for example, on my customers, are based on my margin. So I have an X, a check, or a exclamation based on my value. And I did this by using conditional formatting icon sets. And I chose an indicator. I can manage these indicators by going to conditional formatting, manage rules. And in this pivot table, I can see that my check, exclamation, and X are related to this pivot table. If I wanted to edit this rule in some way, I can modify what these icons mean and choose more specific values. So if I'm not happy with my percent margin until it's at a certain percentage, I can change that here. If I'm satisfied with a 50% margin or above, so my icon set when the value is greater than or equal to 67% is going to be a range value. So it is a percentage, not a percentage of the total as opposed to a percentage of margin. I also have my percent margin below in my location, so I can see that in Canada, my Charlottetown has an acceptable margin percentage, but Montreal does not. So my salesperson can drill into the detail and look into Montreal and see those two customer names and research why they aren't making the margin that they're expecting. I also have a receivables cube where I would be able to view all of the receivables information across my GP companies. I have pivot tables again that are sorting specific information for me. On the top I have revenue by country, and here's where I'd like to point out something that a lot of people see as a benefit of the cubes. All of your data is in one place and it summarizes up to the highest level. If I have various countries that are representing the same piece of information, I'm going to see all records that are available. So right now I have a record for USA, US, and United States. This means that when someone is keying in the customer information, they are not keeping a consistent country syntax. Sometimes they choose United States, sometimes USA, sometimes US. If you're using a smart list or another type of reporting tool and you're filtering on USA, you might be missing some data. So from here, I would be able to drill into the revenue details for US, which would create an additional tab for me. And I would be able to see the customers that are marked as having US as their country. And from here, I can go and modify those customer cards so that I have consistent information. Another way to get to that data is to create a chart of just my countries. So I'm going to create a new tab, and a new pivot table. So to create a connection, I'm going to go to Data, and if I've never created a connection before, I would use From Other Sources and From Analysis Services. But since I have created a connection before, I'm going to go to my existing connections because I already have a connection to my receivables cube inside of this worksheet. I'm going to open, and it's automatically going to populate a pivot table. I can also choose a pivot chart or a cube connection here if I prefer. I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And from here you'll see that I have the ability to look at my receivables aging or my receivables revenue information. I'm going to look at my receivables revenue because I want to investigate a little bit more into my location issues. So I'm going to filter on my customers by location. And just for safe measure, I'm going to change my pivot table options to display all items with no data on rows. And that's going to make sure I don't miss anything. So from here I'm going to expand my USA, US, and United States, and I see that I have multiple states listed under here. And instead of clicking my plus signs 3 times, I can also highlight, right-click, expand entire field, and again I can continue to expand all the way down. If I wanted to save some time, I can also expand to customer name immediately. If everything looks okay in Australia, I can minimize that and continue on and look at all my information. Right now I have Canadian and Canada. Canadian is not a country, so I would recommend updating that. Since I know this customer information now, I could go into GP or my source system and modify that country. I also have an empty record, which means that there is no country assigned, which could be a problem if you're looking at reporting at a locational level. I can also go back and look at my US versus USA and United States as I continue down. If you wanted to filter your information a little bit more, you can also include a date and an amount. So maybe I only want to filter on 2017. Fabricam's current date is 2017, so we'll pretend that that is the current year. And I want to filter and only keep that selected item I just have highlighted. So I don't care if in the past I used to do business with this particular customer. I don't right now, so I'm not going to be concerned about updating the country information. So hopefully you can see that the Analysis Cubes has a lot of data that you can leverage to drill quickly and easily into the information. Alright, so I'm going to go back to the Receivables cube and hide my pivot table options. And from here you can see I have a few more pivot tables, including one with customer name and customer number right next to each other. So by default, your customers are going to stack in a hierarchy, just like we saw on the last tab, where you had US, and below that a state, below that a city, and below that a customer. In this particular report, I have chosen in my customer name field settings in the layout section to show in tabular form. And what this does is put everything right next to each other in line, so I don't need to worry about having 2 lines for the same piece of information. Also on this tab, I have my aging periods and a chart that's referencing my aging periods. And since this is a pivot chart, I still have my filtering ability right here on my chart. So I can either filter on my chart or filter on my pivot table, whichever is more convenient. And I don't even need my pivot table as long as I have my pivot chart. So from here I could filter and just look at my current information or remove my filter and look at everything. Similarly, for my revenue by country, I can filter by just USA and view any additional detail that I want to inside of here. It's probably not very useful to look at USA, but I can compare US, United States, and USA to see what my majority information is. So the vast majority of my information is going to be USA. So it's probably useful for me to update United States and US to be USA. Alright, I'm going to move on and look at payables. So in my payables tab, I have information related to my vendors. And I've also included an app called the Maps, which is new to, I believe, Excel 2010. And I did this in my Insert tab under my apps. It's called a Bing map. And this uses the data inside my spreadsheet to populate a map. This is also a dynamic map, just like the rest of my pivot tables. So if I select a different month, it's going to filter my information and it's going to update my map. And if I have no data, it's just going to have an orange mark instead of a blue visual diagram that shows by size what the magnitude is. So using this map, I can zoom in and view where my data is coming from and see if in Nebraska I have any particular state information. So I could continue to expand my data, for example, and look at Texas, and look specifically at Texas to see that I have data in Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and just Texas in general. And I can use my maps to compare and contrast my amounts across the globe. I can also include this chart over here for freight. For example, I only have, compared to the United States, I have a smaller value going to Canada in terms of revenue. Excuse me, this amount is revenue. And my freight is very large. So I might want to take a second look at how much revenue I'm creating off my Canada customers if my freight is super expensive. So this visual map can indicate a little bit more detail than just looking at numbers in general for some people. On this sheet, I also have a top 10 vendor ranking so that I can view based on my total amount of purchasing amount, how much I'm spending with each vendor. So if I don't include a filter, it's going to be the total amount that I've spent with my vendor across all of time. And then if I use my filters, I can continue to drill into the detail for a particular year and month and view more information behind that vendor. I also have the ability here to do additional actions, drill through, and look at the exact document information that makes up that number. I have a couple of pieces of data here, including the account number if I needed to drill into more financial information. And this information is also customizable. If you need a drill through that has a little bit different of information, that can be done here at IBIS. Okay, so let me go back to my PowerPoint presentation. Alright, so another thing about refreshable reports in Excel, on the connection, you can set your value of refresh time. So on the connection itself, and this is specific down to the pivot table, you can change your refresh to be a certain number of minutes, or to refresh the data as soon as you open the file. And you can also turn off one of the pivot tables to refresh with the rest of the pivot tables if it is a particularly large report that you wanted to refresh manually. If you select the refresh data when opening the file, that would decrease the extra step that a user would need to take when they're opening the file to view the data. They don't have to remember to refresh every time they open the file. Another thing I wanted to show you is the ability to put an embedded chart inside of analysis cubes. By doing this, I am able to put my data inside of my PowerPoint presentation. Maybe it's something that I prepare quarterly or need regularly, and all I want to do is open it and hit refresh. I don't need to go through all the effort of copying, pasting, making sure my data is right. So I'm going to flip back to my desktop and show you that if I was modifying this PowerPoint presentation, since I have my pivot chart already in my PowerPoint, I can modify this in Excel, opened it down here, and I can enable the connection. And from here you can see that I have my selected data viewing my chart inside of Excel. And from here I can open in Excel and I can refresh my data. There we go, all the way open in Excel. So now I can open in Excel, I can go to my data tab and refresh my data and pull in any new information that wasn't previously in my report. I can also choose my date information here on my report and change the time period whenever my quarter comes up, adjust it, save my report, come back and show everyone in my presentation exactly the data that I'm looking at. Unfortunately, since it's a test data, I don't have some fantastically pretty charts to show you, just customer information that's kind of concentrated in one class. The other thing you can do with your dashboards after you create them is put them out on a SharePoint site. This is an Office 365 site that I have uploaded my dashboard to. From here I can view my information. I can change my date filters if I wanted to. I can choose a different date and that will update my report based on the date information I choose here. So I don't need to open in Excel or export or do anything other than just go to this website and adjust my criteria to see the new information. I also have the ability here to add in a link to look at the detail behind the report that I was previously viewing. So from here I can look at the detail behind my net revenue all the way down to my account and date information to look at more detail behind that number. Okay, so that's about all I have for you today.